agent market. LeGarrette Blount led the league in rushing touchdowns last season, had over 1,100 yards on the ground in helping the Patriots to the Super Bowl. Jamaal Charles rushed for over 7,200 yards in his career, but he's played just 8 games over the last two seasons due to a torn ACL. Colin Kaepernick took the 49ers to a Super Bowl in 2012, but just 3-16 as a starter over the last 2 seasons, and then the source of controversy due to his national anthem protest. And Jay Cutler has thrown for over 32,000 yards and more than 200 touchdowns in his career, but he's gone 17-29 as a starter over his last 4 campaigns. So, as we look to this list, and these are names, notable names at that are still out there, the question now, and we're getting really close, do they find a home, before the draft, which I would think in some cases is unlikely, or after? So let's start with LeGarrette Blount.
I'm going to move him to the left here, Wendy, but with a very, very, very slim chance. And in all of these cases, it usually comes down to 3 factors: talent, health, money. For LeGarrette Blount, I believe it's the 3rd factor here. This is a player who had 18 rushing touchdowns last year. You think to yourself, of course he could find work. Well, the Patriots have stockpiled about 1 million running backs now, so there's no home for LeGarrette Blount in New England, where he's always played his best football. Maybe somebody takes a bite at LeGarrette Blount before the draft. I still believe it's a long shot.
Yeah, I think he's struggled there. And the reason why I think you're hesitant, which makes a lot of sense, Field, is the fact that this draft is always interesting to see exactly. You want to get through this to see exactly how it plays out. And LeGarrette, I think, from this other perspective, really should find a home. Like, this is where you push your agent and say, get me a place before this draft happens, because I don't want to be sitting out there playing roulette and then suddenly I've got no seat. So I think that's the most important part. But I think LeGarrette Blount probably doesn't get a deal done. But in a way, maybe a team like the New York Giants don't pull a running back in the draft, and that helps him find a home, and it makes an easier marriage. So we're going to have to see, but I think clubs wait.
Yeah, you say, he hopes to find it before the draft. What's the big benefit for him? Because I would think some opportunity may surface after the draft if teams don't get what they need.
Let's say it's the Giants, or let's say it's the Detroit Lions, Green Bay Packers, teams that may have space for one more running back on their roster. They may get to round 3 and say, we love, for example, Kareem Hunt from Toledo, or some of these other mid-round backs that could become available that are cheaper, younger, and perhaps just as talented.
And you're going to want, once you draft that young player, you're going to want to put them in the spot and say, let's wait on LeGarrette a little bit longer. Let's get this young guy in here. Let's play with him a little bit, see what he is before we move on. And I'm afraid that there's a pretty strong running back class in terms of depth where you can pull guys, like you said, in the 3rd or 4th round, which would limit opportunities for LeGarrette.
All right, so now better than later. How about Jamaal Charles, Mark?
Yeah, Jamaal Charles, I think this one's pretty easy. I'm going to go ahead and highlight him, but put him after the draft. Look, obviously the injuries have been a very frustrating part of Jamaal Charles' career, and he hasn't been able to be on the field very much over the last 2 seasons, really. So when you factor in the injuries, especially, and the lack of production, this means signing later, much later. And I think that's one of the things where you sit there and say, Jamaal Charles may not sign until training camp. I mean, that's where I think this one could go in terms of a team that maybe gets banged up there. But I think it's going to be hard because of all the injury history. And opposite of LeGarrette Blount, because he's been productive. That's why I put Jamaal Charles on the other side.
What would you offer Charles?
Well, I think he's a minimum salary benefit contract now, I'm afraid. I mean, that's where we really are in free agency right now. And I think every general manager's at the TV going, yeah, that's where we are right now. We're in minimum salary benefit world. And so if he's willing to take that, that's one thing. But again, there's no rush for a club because, again, if you draft a kid or a young man, you're going to want to give them every opportunity. Jamaal Charles, I think, is more of an emergency guy now, where if you have an injury happen, that's going to open up the door faster for Jamaal than anything else.
If it's more money than that minimum salary benefit, you build in protection through things like per-game roster bonuses and a split salary in case he ends up on IR. Things like that teams do to protect themselves in the case of a player being vulnerable to injury.
Let's switch gears to quarterbacks. Jay Cutler's agent, Bus Cook, made some news yesterday when he said, you know what? My client is not interested in retirement. He hasn't said that. He doesn't want to retire. He wants to play because it had been suggested perhaps that Jay Cutler was ready to hang it up. So if he's not, before or after the draft, and perhaps where?
Well, this right column might get a little bit crowded here, Wendy.
I would think so.
Going to have to be after the draft for Jay Cutler because at this point, listen, if there's a position where you make your commitment, you make it firmly, and you make it clearly, it's quarterback. No team has pounced on Jay Cutler, which tells you that teams like, for example, the Houston Texans are intrigued enough by the draft class to perhaps invest in a quarterback there. GM Rick Smith said they're going to add a 3rd quarterback beyond Tom Savage and Brandon Weeden. If they don't get that player in the draft, perhaps Jay Cutler surfaces there. Otherwise, it could be that he is the next man up, the 33rd quarterback in the NFL in case some team has an injury to its starter.
Would you take a flyer on Jay Cutler at this point?
Yeah, I would. I would actually take a flyer on Jay Cutler, and certainly is going to be after the draft when your agent has to come out and say, hey, he's not retiring. It means we haven't had a lot of action, so may not get a deal too quick. Yeah. But I think Jay Cutler, I do think Houston's a very interesting landing spot for him. After that, I wonder sometimes, like a Matt Moore is a backup in Miami, and a good backup, and somebody that somebody might want to trade for. And I could see Adam Gase say, hey, look, if Jay Cutler's just going to sit out there, I'll bring him here and just let him kind of train with me and be our number 2 if you could do something. So there's room for him. Jay Cutler will sign a contract in the NFL. I think Colin Kaepernick will, but we'll get to him in a minute.
All right, that's a perfect segue, Mark Dominic, because I think that would be exactly my question. Not if, or not when, perhaps, Field, but in the case of Colin Kaepernick, if. Will he find a place to play?
Just for housekeeping, we'll move that to the right column after the draft, Wendy. I think it comes down to a couple of factors. At one point this offseason, I believe Colin Kaepernick felt like there was a starting job available for him somewhere in the NFL. That's probably part of the motivation for him of opting out of his contract, or renegotiating his contract, I should say, last season. There is not a starting job right now for Colin Kaepernick. And it can be a part of, some of it can be just sort of a mindset shift that goes from being a starting quarterback to a backup quarterback, or a guy competing for a backup job. At the right price, I think a team would consider Colin Kaepernick, even with everything that has come with it in the past.
But you know what? A player has to get there. You have to get there on your own to say, I was a starting quarterback. Now this is where I am, and I'm comfortable with that. And sometimes that takes some time. Sometimes you don't get there. It just sort of depends.
We saw this concern happen, this Jay Cutler, Colin Kaepernick, right at the beginning of free agency. If you remember, we talked about all the quarterbacks that were going to be available in free agency, the movement, and there just wasn't enough chairs. And so certainly these two players have run into that, musical chairs, where they're like, whoa, what just happened? But Colin Kaepernick, absolutely, in my opinion, will get signed before the start of training camp.
Well, Jeff Darlington joins us now from San Francisco, where he's covering the draft and has more, perhaps, on what the 49ers are thinking about in terms of quarterback. Jeff?
Well, Wendy, when we talk about the 49ers and quarterbacks, obviously we're going to bring up Mitch Trubisky, because he's certainly flying up a lot of draft boards as we are on the eve of the draft. But I'll tell you, from the conversations I'm having with those around the league, it doesn't even look like Trubisky might be on the board at number 2 if the Browns wind up taking him first overall, something that seems to be more of a likelihood as the hours progress. Now, if that's the case, Myles Garrett obviously makes sense for the 49ers. Say that Myles Garrett does wind up going to the Browns. I don't get the sense at this point that the 49ers are wanting to take Trubisky at 2nd overall, but instead would rather go with what they got in Brian Hoyer and Matt Barkley. Hey, maybe look down the road. Kirk Cousins could become available next year, a guy that Kyle Shanahan really likes. There's other quarterbacks that will be available in next year's draft. So when it comes to quarterbacks in the 49ers,